Amen. Okay, we're going to continue with our Unlocking Revelation seminar, and this week, actually for the next 2 weeks, our topic will be the 7 churches and the 7 seals.
Oh, I like that.
So this will take us pretty much through the first section of Revelation, all the way really to the through the first 7 chapters of Revelation. So, and we're going to do it in a quick way. We're not going to go over every verse, but you're going to get the main stuff of the first 7 chapters of Revelation over the next 2 weeks. Now, being that this is kind of the first section of Revelation, let's look at the first chapter of Revelation and see kind of what the point of the book is. And a lot of people just glance over this, but can somebody read the first verse, the first chapter of Revelation?
The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place, and he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John.
Okay, so there's a lot actually in there. It's going to tell us what's going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. And it was sent. So God the Father gave the message. There's kind of a chain of command here, almost a chain of passing on the message. Mm-hmm. So it said, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave unto him. Of course, that's speaking of God the Father. So God the Father gives a message to Jesus. Jesus then gives it.
Sorry.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning, Pastor King.
Nice to see you. Jesus then gives it to John, but through his angel. Right. So it goes Father, then to Jesus, then to an angel, then to John. And then John gives it to us. Exactly. Yeah. Kind of a passing the message on here. But what I really want you to see here in verse 1 is that it says it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. Good morning.
Good morning.
Please join us. There's still plenty of seats.
So, we're getting bigger now.
Yeah, there we go. We only had a few and now we're grown. So whatever you see, whenever you study the book of Revelation, there's lots of beasts and there's lots of prophecy and this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But it should all be, in some way, it should be a revelation of Jesus Christ. Right. So it should show us something about God's character because that's who Jesus is. He is the express image of who God is. Mm-hmm. Revealed to man, right? Yes. So we're going to see the history here and see these prophetic events. Good morning. Good morning. In the 7 churches and the 7 seals. But as we do, keep in mind, how does this history and these prophecies, how does this reflect on who God is? Okay, 7 churches and 7 seals. Mm-hmm. So you guys may remember our first study that we did in this morning class was on an overview on the book of Revelation.
Yes.
Remember that?
Yeah.
And we walked through and we saw how the different pieces of furniture from the Old Testament sanctuary are shown in order in the book of Revelation. And the first piece of furniture.
Would you say that again?
As you go through the book of Revelation in order, you see the different pieces of furniture that were in the tabernacle. And you see them in order as you walk through. So the first one that you would notice as you walk in would be probably the 7 golden candlesticks. It's the thing that's glowing brightly as soon as if you were to walk in. You'd probably notice that first. It'd probably catch your eye. And that's where Revelation starts. So Revelation 1 through 3 is the 7 churches. And then chapters 4 through 8 verse 1 is the 7 seals.
Yes.
And we saw the idea that, I told you this before, and I told you we'd explain it later, that the 7 churches depicts the history of the Christian church from the days of the apostles until the second coming. Yes. That's what the 7 churches does. Mm-hmm. It's just an overview of the whole history of the church. And the number 7 is very important. Yes. In the Bible, the number 7 usually signifies a whole process, right? God created the world in
7 days.
7 days, right? Mm-hmm. Well, 6 days and 7th day you rest, but the whole, you get the idea. And in Proverbs it says, a righteous man falls 7 times and rises again. That's not literal. It doesn't mean you only fall 7 times in your life, right? You fall much more than that, right?
Symbolic, yeah.
It's symbolic, meaning they go through the whole process of falling and until they finally get up again and learn from their lessons. That's the idea. So, the 7 churches should right away, since it's using that number, should tell you this is symbolic for the whole church. 7, the whole thing. Okay. And the next thing you would notice as you walked into the sanctuary would be the table of showbread. It's the next closest thing to you as you walked in. Those 2 are on the right and left of you. And that's the next thing that's depicted in Revelation. And it again, it's the 7 seals, is related to this table of showbread. And it again tells the history of the Christian church from the days of the apostles to the second coming.
Are those cups? Or are those between the...
In between, I think, yeah, they might be cups, but I don't know.
Were those part of the sanctuary actually?
Yeah, it looks like cups. I think it mentions cups. I don't know.
What do those mean?
Question. I don't know. We'd have to look back into it and see
We
if there
have 6
actually
showbread, right?
even is cups. The important thing is the showbread.
The
It's
showbread.
table
Yeah,
of
6,
showbread.
6, right?
Yes, 12.
Yeah.
12.
12.
12.
Absolutely.
I just
Absolutely.
want to make sure I did it right on Monday.
Oh, you're right.
Because I was doing the sanctuary.
Absolutely. It was 12 for the 12 tribes. And as you go into the chapter on the 7 seals, you'll see that at the introduction in chapters 4 and 5 is this throne room scene.
Mhm.
And there's the 24 elders around the throne and the 4 living creatures.
Yes.
We don't have time to go into all that today, but it's interesting. You can think of that in terms of the 12 tribes.
Right.
Morning.
Good morning.
Please join us.
Hi, very happy. Come here, come here.
Okay.
Go there. Sorry.
Plenty of seats.
You.
So, the question is, who is this message for? The 7 churches. Who is this message for? Go to Revelation chapter 1 and let's read verse 10 and 11. Can somebody read that for us, please? Revelation chapter 1, verse 10 and 11, please.
I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and I heard behind me a loud voice as of a trumpet, saying, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last. And what you see, write in the book and send it to the 7 churches, which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea.
Okay, well, there are people who say that because of this verse, that means that this section was written to those specific churches that existed in Asia, and therefore the message really isn't for us.
Then,
And so it's just
No.
back then,
Just for
first
them.
century, there it is, it's just for them. So, I think that's problematic. Number one, why would God do that, right? Why would he put a whole section in this last day events book and just write it, and this is only for that first century church, and then, forget about it. It's not for you in the future, right? That doesn't make any sense to me.
So I noticed
Right
that
away.
Patmos is just a little island close to those 7 churches.
Yes, it's off on the side. Yes. That's where John was when he gave the message. And those were literal 7 churches.
Yeah.
So John was here on the island of Patmos. And the 7 churches were these 7 cities that had churches in them in Asia Minor. This is
Turkey today.
what's that?
It's Turkey today.
Turkey.
Yeah.
Israel's like down here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the Mediterranean. So Ephesus is the first one, and you'll notice that they're in order. You could walk 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and that's the order that they're listed in the book of Revelation.
Yes.
So it's as if you're walking through these different ones. So some people believe that the first 3 chapters of Revelation are just for those 7 churches that existed in those days, and they don't have anything to do with us today. The problem with that is this. Can somebody read verse 19 and 20? Other than the fact that it doesn't really make sense for God to just write that message only for those people when this is a major last day events book. But there's also this problem. Can somebody read verse 19 and 20, please?
chapter 2.
Chapter 1, sorry. Chapter 1, 19 and 20.
Write the things which thou hast seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. The mystery of the 7 stars, which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks which thou sawest are the 7 churches.
Okay, so right away we see that in the context of the 7 churches, we are told, John is told, write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. Do you see that? There's 2 things, the things which are, present tense, and which shall be hereafter. That's the context of the 7 churches. Now, if you think that's not a big deal that he mentioned it like that, I want you to notice that when he goes into the 7 seals, it's different. Let's see, chapter 4, verse 1. After this I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven, and the first voice which I heard was as it were a trumpet talking with me, which said, Come up hither, I will show thee things which must be hereafter. Do you know the part that's left out? Do you see that? He doesn't say, I will show you things which are and which shall be hereafter. So the 7 seals is all future prophecy. But the 7 churches is both things which are and which shall be hereafter. Do you guys see that? So it's present tense and future. You get the idea? So what it does is the prophecy uses these literal 7 churches, things which are, as an object lesson for what shall be, things which shall be after, the future. You see that? It's both. It's both at the same time. So yes, their messages of the 7 churches does give messages for those churches that lived in those days. But they are also things which shall be hereafter. It's also future. It's both, same time. And the Old Testament prophets did this all the time. They would use something that happened to a local or a specific city as a prophecy towards something in the future. And they would mix the 2 together. So, for example, Sodom and Gomorrah, we are told, is a symbol of what will happen to all those who are destroyed by the fires of hell. So it's a symbol of that. And the same thing is when Jerusalem was destroyed. It gave, in the middle of that destruction of Jerusalem, it starts talking about the second coming of Jesus. And so the 2 things are mixed together, things which are and which shall be. You see that? And the other way you know is because verse 20, the context of Revelation 1, 19 and 20, in verse 20, he starts talking about how it's symbolic. The candlesticks are a symbol for the churches, the stars are a symbol for the angels. So we know that there's lots of symbolism in this chapter. So you shouldn't take everything extremely literally. If there's lots of symbolism. Does that make sense? This idea is called telescoping in prophecy. Telescoping, it's also called collocation. These are fancy theological terms. The basic idea is that it's a dual application of prophecy. Good morning.
Good morning.
Please. We're in Revelation chapter 1, looking at the 7 churches. Glad you can make it. So the idea of telescoping in prophecy, here's kind of an artist's depiction of how this works. So say, for example, the prophet Isaiah, right? So you have Isaiah, and he's given in vision. You know, prophets, they don't know everything in the future. You know that? They don't know everything. They only know in the future what? What do they know? What God tells them. That's it. God tells them these little parts, and that's all they get. Imagine when you go to the ocean or something and they have those binoculars. Or you go on some nice scenic area and they have that, you put a quarter in, the binocular works, right? And it's stationed there. You can only see what that thing allows you to see when you look through it, right?
Yeah.
That's the way it is with prophets. God shows them, and he only shows them in the future what they need to know. And that's all they know. Everything in between, all the other stuff, they don't know, right? They just reveal what God says. So imagine you're Isaiah, and God gives you a bunch of prophecies about the future. Now, you have the prophet's own time. Now these are all mountains. All these different events are pictured as mountains, high points in history. There's the prophet's own time. He knows that, right? Because he lives it. And then there's things like Isaiah saw the Israel's exile and restoration, but he was given future events on that. Then he was giving prophecies about the first coming of Jesus, right? He was also giving prophecies about tribulation times. He was giving prophecies about the second coming of Christ. And he was giving prophecies about the new heavens and the new earth.
Yes.
Isaiah did not know the gaps in between, right?
No.
He was only given the high points in history.
Yes.
And in the prophecies, you'll see they're kind of mixed together, all these high points in history. And you can imagine Isaiah with the telescope looking, and he only sees the high points of the mountain. He doesn't see the gaps in between. Does that make sense? That's why it's called telescoping in prophecy. Here's another visual. So if you were to stand looking at a bunch of ridges of mountains, you see them, and it looks like they're all clustered together, right? But really, you know that the mountains in behind, you don't know how far away they are from the ones in front. But from your perspective, you just see the tops. They look together, right? Now, what if you were to look from a bird's eye view? You see that there's distance in between, right? That's the idea. And so you jump from, here's my immediate event, to future event, but they look close to the prophet, and they're mentioned together. That's the idea. Telescoping in prophecy. Okay. So we talked about that, telescoping in prophecy. Let me give you guys a really good example of this. It's a famous example. Turn to Isaiah chapter 7, because I really want to solidify this point so that you guys don't think I'm just making up this idea, because this is all over the Old Testament. And really, if you understand this point, you will understand much better the Old Testament prophecies, because the majority of the time, this is what they use. Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. You guys are probably all familiar with this verse. Therefore, the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now, what's that talking about?
The first advent.
The first advent of Christ, right?
Right.
Yes. But, what else is it talking about?
Jesus?
Well, that was the first advent of
okay.
Christ, but what else is it talking about? Scholars have recognized, and this is clear if you read the context, if you read down through verse 17, that when Isaiah said this, there was a dual application of prophecy. He was also predicting current events. So look at the context. Verse.
In his days.
Let's see here. I mean, if you just read the beginning of it, Isaiah goes and gives a message to Ahaz. And verse 10, moreover, the Lord spake again unto Ahaz, saying, ask thee a sign of the Lord thy God, ask it in the depth or in the height above.
Yeah.
Verse 12, but Ahaz says, I will not ask, neither will I tempt the Lord. Verse 13, and he said, hear ye now, house of David, is a small thing for you to weary me, but will you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Now go on. Butter and honey shall he eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that thou abhorrest shall be forsaken of both her kings. The Lord shall bring upon thee and upon thy people. This is speaking to Ahaz. And upon thy people and upon thy father's house days that have not come, from the days of Ephraim departed from Judah, even the king of Assyria. So, the king of Assyria is coming. That's the immediate prophecy. So the idea is, look, a woman's going to bear a child, and before that child knows to refuse the evil and choose the good, so before the child is of, an age of accountability where it knows what's going on, within a very short amount of time, the king of Assyria is coming to you, Ahaz. That's the immediate prophecy. But there's a dual application, right? We know that because the New Testament quotes this prophecy and says this was fulfilled when Jesus was born. And the word for virgin there in Isaiah 7:14, it could simply mean a young woman,
Mm.
or it could mean literally a virgin. And in Isaiah's day, it probably just meant a young woman will have a child, and probably Isaiah's wife. That's what most scholars believe. But the dual application is a literal virgin will have a child. And that was when Jesus was born. So you see it's both. You see that? Are you guys confused?
So basically, it's dual because
Both
during
things.
during the time Isaiah was told by God that what will happen before the Messiah, the first Advent will come, that they will be invaded by Assyrians to Ahaz.
What I'm saying is that 2 women gave birth to children. A woman in Jesus's day, a woman in Isaiah's day gave birth to a child, and before that child, and probably Isaiah's wife, and before that child knew to choose the good and refuse the evil, the king of Assyria was to come upon Israel, upon Ahaz. Right? That was the immediate prophecy. It has a dual application for the future when Jesus came. And then it was a virgin would conceive.
That's Matthew 1:23.
Matthew 1:23. Matthew quotes this verse and said it was fulfilled when Jesus came. So
But
it's both.
Right.
Go
literally,
ahead.
that time, was that they believe that Isaiah's wife
Uh-huh.
bore a child
Uh-huh.
at
Uh-huh.
that time. Okay,
That's
that's the
what most scholars
Present.
believe, because when you look at it, there's other times in this book in Isaiah where Isaiah's wife had children and they were named after some kind of future event that's coming, and that, yeah. Well, isn't it the one that had Mayhar or Shalhazbaz, a really long name, right? That meant something. Anyway, yeah. So you get the idea. Okay. Hopefully I didn't confuse you guys too much. Basically, the idea is just a dual application of
Well, it
prophecy.
happens a lot in the Bible, like, for example, when they explain Satan, they're explaining another king.
I was
But
yeah.
it's
Like Tyler.
Satan- Yeah, exactly. and it's
We'll go
Satan
into
and the
that.
king.
It's both at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes.
we'll go into that in a couple slides. That's a good point. Absolutely. Okay, another way, how do we know that the 7 churches is symbolic? We're not going to go through all 7 churches today, but we're going to go through the first 3. How do we know that the 7 churches is symbolic for time periods, which is what I'm saying that this is, and what many scholars have agreed on. Another way that we can know that this is symbolic, go to Revelation chapter 2. It starts mentioning characters that have died centuries and centuries ago. And so you know that's symbolic. So Revelation chapter 2 verse 14 mentions Balaam.
Mm-hmm.
You guys know who Balaam was?
Yes.
That was during the days of Moses, right?
Way before Jezebel.
Way before Jezebel.
Yeah.
And by the way, Balaam, you guys remember he had a prophecy?
Yes.
Another perfect example of telescoping in prophecy. In Balaam's prophecy, what does he do? Remember the story? He goes up onto a mountain and he looks down on Israel, and what is he supposed to do?
To
Curse them.
yeah,
To curse them, right? But when he goes up and he looks down on them, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him and he can't curse them. Instead, he prophesies and he blesses them, right?
Yeah.
And the king who sent him to curse him was very mad. Oh, I paid you to curse him, and now you're
Having
blessed
good
him even
things.
more, right?
Yeah.
When you read Balaam's prophecy, he looks at him and he said, oh, I behold the tents of Jacob, and he starts talking about how good it looks, right?
Mhm.
And how beautiful Israel is. In the middle of his prophecy about how they are currently, he says, a star shall arise
Right.
out
Yeah.
of Jacob, right? And a scepter shall arise, right?
Yes.
He gives a prophecy about the first coming.
Yes.
That's a couple thousand years later.
Mhm.
Right.
But he mixes the two, what's happening now and the first coming. You guys see that?
Mhm.
Right.
So the prophets did that all the time in the Old Testament. They mix these 2 events together. Okay.
So the present and the future.
The present and the future, it's mixed together, yep. So Balaam is mentioned in Revelation 2. Do you guys think that's literal? Is that really Balaam? Or is that a symbol? It's not. He's dead. He's been dead for centuries.
Yeah, but it's a
It's a symbol of his style of corrupting the church is what he
Correct.
did, yeah.
False prophecies.
A false prophet, yep. And then you look at verse 20, and it mentions Jezebel.
Mm-hmm.
Was that literal? Was Jezebel really walking around during the time of these these 7 churches, was she walking around corrupting the people? No, she had died centuries before. Clearly this is a symbol.
But the
And
character of Jezebel
The
is in
character,
the
the
church.
same, a similar way of corrupting the church, absolutely. So it's symbolic. The 7 churches are literal, they happened in the first century, but it's also symbolic for future time periods. You guys get it? Okay. Here's an overview of the history, very quickly, and then we'll go into each one. This is the 7 time periods that are mentioned in the 7 churches, very quickly. First one, the Apostolic Church. Obviously, that's the first time period, right? The time of the apostles. When the Bible was written, when the 12 apostles were alive, the first period of the church. The church was very pure at this stage. And it was a very great missionary expansion time. Paul was going around starting churches everywhere. The apostles went, traveled all over the world, and the church grew rapidly during this time. Okay, that's the first time period, the Apostolic Church. The second time period was the persecuted church. Shortly after that, the church, because it grew so rapidly, it got the attention of the authorities, the Roman Empire, right? And what did the Roman Empire do?
They go around.
I mean, you can read about the
They
stories of
persecute.
Nero, right?
Oh, yes.
And they would use Christians as lampposts,
Yes.
coat them with
You
pitch
burn
and
them.
tar and burn them as lamps. It was crazy. They would throw Christians to the lions as sport in the Colosseum. This was this time of great persecution in the early church. Okay, many martyrs in those days. Go
Was this
ahead.
about 1538?
Oh, this was like
Yeah,
the
500.
2nd century, 3rd century. This is very early on.
Yeah.
Under Diocletian and Nero and
Nero,
Yes,
Diocletian,
Diocletian, yes, very early on, the very early persecution.
right
Because
after
there's
the
different
Caesar.
persecutions.
yeah.
Right after the apostles' days. Okay. The next time period was that the church was corrupted. The doctrines in the church were corrupted, and the way that happened was it was mixed with paganism. Roman paganism and Christianity blended together. And that was the time, this is around the time of Constantine.
That's 321 AD.
Yeah, 321 AD was Constantine, yeah. So, this was the time of where, if you look at history, you'll see that Christian writers were arguing in this time that we should adopt pagan practices. And their argument was that by doing this, we are conquering paganism. We have the right.
But they are pagan.
It's a bad idea. It was a really bad idea. But that's the corruption that happened in the church, and it was very well known. Okay. The next time period was the official unity. These doctrines that had been taught of merging paganism with Christianity, it was argued, but it wasn't official yet. The next time period was all these false teachings that had come into the church became official church doctrine and were enforced. And this was a time really when the Roman Catholic Church was in power. This was about the 6th century through the Dark Ages. Okay? That's the next time period. The next major time period is the Protestant Reformation. That's obviously what happened after the Catholic Church's great reign. Then you have men like Wycliffe and Martin Luther and Huss, right? And they came in and they reformed the church. And this is, 16th century and on. Good morning. Please join us. There's a couple of seats there. Maybe get this out of the way. I have more room here. Thank you. Okay, so there's the Protestant Reformation. That's the next time period. The next time period, which we talked about, was, do you guys remember there was all the signs? We studied the signs of the times. The signs in the heavens, the stars fell, and the dark day, and the moon turned, and the great earthquake, right? That was around this time period, and it was called the Great Awakening. It was also called the Great Second Advent Movement.
That's in 1844.
That's exactly around the 1700s, 1800s. This is the
So 17.
referred to as the Millerite movement sometimes. this great awakening
1700.
in America and Europe, this great awakening, religious awakening, revival from seeing those signs. And it was called the Second Advent movement because one of their chief things that they taught is that the Lord's coming soon.
Yep.
That second advent of Christ, right? Okay. And then the last time period is the last days church. I believe that's the days we're living in today. So, that's an overview of the history. You guys see that? Any disagreements that this is history, right? I mean, this is pretty much well-known history.
So
Okay.
you put names, that will be
We'll do that.
oh,
This is the overview.
you will,
Yeah.
okay,
The advance.
okay.
Okay, so now, thinking of this overview that we just looked at, think of Satan's plan of attack throughout history and God's response. Notice how he does it, okay? So first God establishes this pure apostolic church, spreads it all over the world. What's Satan's immediate response?
Persecution.
Kill him, right? There's Christians all over the place. Stamp them out, you know? It's like they're growing, it's everywhere, and he's just trying to get rid of them, right? So he sends Rome, kill him, right? And he uses the Roman Empire to kill him. That didn't work, right?
Correct.
They said that the blood of the martyrs was the seed of the gospel. So the more you killed them, the more there was converts.
Multiply.
They kept growing.
Right.
You couldn't get rid of them that way.
Mhm.
So he had to change his tactics. Instead of killing them,
Correct.
He
corrupt the
He
church.
joined them.
Exactly, join them and corrupt them.
Yeah.
Now these two tactics go together because you can imagine yourself in those days having seen the persecution and now you're offered, now you're offered acceptance. You can have peace, we won't kill you anymore, let's just compromise a little bit,
Yeah.
right? And you can imagine there was a lot of pressure on Christians in those days to compromise their teachings. And then once Satan has got that, once he's got that in the church, and he's got this stronghold in the church of corruption, then he makes it official, and he uses those now corrupt leaders to persecute anyone who goes against it, which would be people who are just trying to follow God in the first place. So then you have a repeat of the persecution,
In Protestant Reformation.
but it's done, instead of being done by the Roman authorities, it's now being done by the church itself, persecuting other Christians.
So the persecuted now are persecuting.
Exactly. Incredible. So you can see this kind of flow of logic of Satan's attack. But God responds. And his response
Oh, great.
brings in the Protestant Reformation, right?
Right.
So truth gets back restored. And then there's this great religious awakening, and it grows even more. God brings these signs in the heaven to stir the people up. And that prepares for the last day church, for the final events. So the church is now able and has the truth to withstand the final events. You guys see the flow of history here?
Yeah.
The logic of it? And God's
Yeah.
response.
Yeah, because-
Interesting, right?
Want to go back again?
Yeah.
It's like, because between the Protestant Reformation and the Great Awakening, again, the true church went again down, began to again go back into compromising and went into sleep, so they had to be awakened again.
Yeah, with the signs, absolutely. Okay, so let's look at the first three churches. This will be pretty quick, I think. The first church, Ephesus. That's the name of the first church. Let's go to Revelation chapter 2. And you're looking really in verse 1 through verse 7. That is the first church, Ephesus. The name Ephesus.
It's a picture of Ephesus.
What's that called?
Yes. Yeah, that's a picture of one of the ruins in Ephesus.
The library.
And they're having a concert there.
Wasn't it called the Loveless Church also?
Well, it said it forgot its first love.
Oh, yeah.
So the name of Ephesus means desirable. That's what it means. It means like a desirable bride, right?
Mhm.
That's the first church. This is the apostolic church from about the time of where Jesus left, about 34 AD till about 100 AD.
Yeah.
It's not exact dates.
That's right after the death of John.
Exactly, about that time. So, the introduction, every one of the 7 churches has an introduction where Jesus introduces himself in a certain way, and there's a time period, and it has major points that he makes, and then there's an outro where he says a final thing. So the introduction here, it tells you something about it. And now this one seems a little bit general. Verse 1. Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write, These things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, and walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. Now, he just mentioned that in the last verse of chapter 1. It seems like a very general greeting for the whole 7 churches. Alright, now let's move on and look at the points here, and we'll see how this refers to the apostolic church. Verse 2. I know thy works and thy labor, thy patience, and that thou canst not bear with them which are evil, and thou hast tried them which say they are apostles, and are not, and have found them liars. So there are false apostles, and the church is able to distinguish between which ones are false and which ones are true. You see that?
That's true.
You have looked at those who say they're apostles, you found them liars, right? Now, if there were false apostles, then that means that there were true apostles.
Right.
Exactly. This is the days of the apostolic church.
Yeah.
And the church is still able to distinguish between true and false apostles. Jump down to verse 4. Nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. Right? So again, we see this time period of the early church, the church that had its first love, and very quickly it sees that it has left its first love. Right?
I like the fact that you said, this is like the bride, right?
Yes.
And the coupleship, you're supposed to grow more in love, not stay stuck in the first love and even go down. Right?
And it looks like this church had very quickly lost its first love.
Right.
Now notice that the word labor is mentioned twice. Verse 2, I know thy works, thy labor, right? Verse 3, and hast borne, hast patience for my name's sake, hast labored, and has not fainted. So the word labor is mentioned twice in this time period. This is a time of great work, right? The church is working. It's laboring for the Lord.
Right.
It's the time of great missionary expansion.
Yeah.
You guys see that? Next thing to notice. The Nicolaitans are mentioned in verse 6. Now, I mentioned I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. I'm not going to go through every point here, but just to kind of establish that this is the apostolic church. Verse 6. But this thou hast, that thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So the church in this time period hates the Nicolaitans. Now you may say, who are the Nicolaitans? The Nicolaitans were people who taught that what you do in your body does not matter. Because your body is a shell, and you're just going to leave this shell, and your spirit lasts forever, and your spirit never sins. So what you do in your body doesn't matter. Sin, whatever, doesn't matter. Your spirit is all that matters. And your body's just a shell. Do whatever you want, right? These were a form of Gnostics. And we know that the early church was plagued by Gnostics and Nicolaitans. So again, this is the early church, plagued by these false teachers who were trying to mix Christianity with paganism. That's what Gnosticism is, and that's what Nicolaitan teachings were. But is the church falling for it? Now, does this church fall for it? Verse 6. But this thou hast, thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. So this early church doesn't fall for it. You see that? It's a pure church. It's working hard. It's got the apostles. It can tell between true and false. The only problem is it lost its first love. But it is very pure in other ways. So we see that this is the early church plagued by Gnostics, but it's able to refute them. Here's the outro, verse 7. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him that overcometh, I will give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. This is a reference to Genesis, to Eden, to the beginning.
Right.
And it's interesting that the first church has a reference to the beginning. We see the theme here of this first church.
Only takes us 1 year. That's all.
What's that?
Only takes us 1 year.
To listen.
You need to have in 2 years.
Oh, he who has an ear?
Yeah, 1
That's
year.
fun.
Right?
I never noticed that. You only need 1 ear to hear.
Yeah.
Okay, agreed. All right, second church. Smyrna. This is the second church. This is the time of persecution, right? Historically, this is what happened. right? Here's an artist depiction of Christians in the Colosseum and the lions being let out and the people watching. That was the time period. Not fun. Okay. So, Smyrna. The name means sweet smelling when burned. It's where you get the word myrrh, right? Smyrna, myrrh, which is a form of incense. Incense.
Yeah.
Now the idea is not that God likes his people dying. That's not the idea. The idea is more, think of this. What couple, I mean, let's say you're in a situation where, you know, a husband has to, in order to save his bride's life, he has to give his life for her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Truly romantic. Now, a bride would be touched by that, right? Would she want that? No.
No.
She doesn't want it. But given that situation, that shows somebody's love and devotion, right?
It's
That
like
they would go
Jesus.
that far. Jesus did that for us, right?
Yeah.
And he says, if I, you know, that we should do the same for each other if we love each other, right? And so this is the church willing to die for the faith. And that is beautiful in God's eyes. Not that he doesn't like to see them punished, but it's beautiful that they're willing to die for the faith.
I just wanted to add also that, you know, it shows loyalty,
Exactly.
and that's beautiful.
That's beautiful. And on top of that, the Old Testament says, beautiful in the sight of the Lord are his saints when they die. Why?
They can be trusted.
Well, they can be trusted, but their troubles are over. They're going to heaven, right? When a saint dies, when a righteous man dies, that's a wonderful thing, actually. For them,
They go
right?
to heaven after the resurrection.
After the resurrection, but their fate is sealed.
Yeah.
They're good, right? So that's a beautiful thing. So the word Smyrna means sweet smelling when burned. And that's a very apt description of this time of persecution. The church was literally burned and persecuted. It's the early Christian persecution. The time period's about 100 AD, after the apostles were gone, till about 313 AD. Okay, let's look at the introduction, verse 9. Or verse 8, I'm sorry. Unto the angel of the church of Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Now, why do you think Jesus would mention that to this particular church?
To show that you died and resurrected again.
Absolutely. Jesus says, hey, you guys are gonna die? I was dead and I'm alive again. You see that? So these introductions they have a reason why he says it like this.
Encourage them to.
Encourage them. Yes. So the introduction, Jesus says that he is the one who is dead and is alive. Alright? Verse 9. I know thy works and tribulation. Was that mentioned in the previous church? No, it wasn't.
On the works.
This is a time of persecution, right?
Yeah.
The church goes through a tribulation. Verse 10, it says, fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. You see the key words here? This is a time of persecution. Verse 10 also, it says, behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison.
Yes.
This is a time of persecution. And he says, be faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Again, this theme of persecution, you're going to have to die for the faith, that's the theme of this church. This is definitely the church of persecution. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. And, notice this is a very short church. It goes from verse 8 through verse 11 and it's done.
Yep.
It's very short,
Yeah.
very short.
That's a
4 verses.
good name. to
So, notice this, verse 10. Fear none of the things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days.
hear. Yeah. Then
Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Okay,
What days a year?
in Bible prophecy, a day is a year.
yes.
So this is a period of 10 years of persecution. That period, this is amazing, was from 303 AD to 313 AD. these time periods are very well defined in history. It's very clear, this is well known to even secular scholars, that there was a 10-year period of persecution, heavy persecution of the church.
Yeah,
That is a statue of Diocletian,
yeah.
and he was the emperor in 303 AD, and he put out an edict on February 24th, 303 AD. This is very well-known history. We know the exact date this decree went out, and it was the edict against the Christians. They would have their property taken away. They would have, all the symbols of Christianity were to be removed, the crosses, the books were to be burned. The Christians could not defend themselves in court. So if a Christian was brought up on any charges, they couldn't defend themselves. So whatever you accuse them of, guess what? They're guilty. Right? Because they can't defend themselves. Can you imagine if your legal rights were removed where you couldn't defend yourself in court? You basically, the emperor is saying open season on Christians, right? And so he put this decree out in February. By June, the mobs had started to kill Christians. This went on for a time period of 10 years. And then Constantine, in the Edict of Milan, this is very well-known history, 313 AD, he put an end to it. Oh, and during this time, if you were a Christian senator or a Christian military leader, you would be removed from your ranks. Your ranks were stripped from you. So no high positions for Christians anymore. They're all removed from any... and if you were a Christian who was a slave that had been freed, you went back to slavery. It was a very bad time. And it was from 303 to 313, exactly 10 years. Now, when was Revelation written?
During 1980.
About 90 AD, according to secular scholars, even people who don't believe the Bible will tell you Revelation was written 90 AD, about latest, like 100 AD. When did this 10 years of persecution happen?
200 years later.
200 years later, there was an exactly 10-year period of persecution. That is amazing prophecy, right? Amazing. Happened exactly like he said. Now, notice this. There is no rebuke for this church.
Oh, that's right.
No rebuke. All the churches, you'll notice that they says, I noticed this, you're doing this and this right, but you're doing this wrong, right? This church, no rebuke. It's almost as if God's saying, you guys have enough problems, right? And they must be very pure during this time because you didn't join the church unless you were willing to give your life for it.
Yeah.
So the church doesn't need a rebuke in this time period.
Yeah.
There's only two churches that don't get a rebuke. This one and the sixth church, but we'll go into that later. Okay. And the outro, again, mentions this theme of death. Verse 11. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the church. He that overcometh shall not be hurt by the second death.
Wow, they're already no second death. They're
So
sure.
you will die in this life, but you won't die eternally.
Yeah, only one time.
Only one time.
Is it the first time that he's mentioned the second death in
In
Revelation?
Revelation, I believe
I
so.
think it's the
Yes.
first
I
time.
believe so.
So
Yeah.
you're dying the first death. Don't worry about
Don't
it.
worry
You will
about
not
the
die the
second
second death.
Fear not those who can kill the body.
Yeah.
But, yeah, exactly, right?
Oh, okay.
That's the idea. So this is the time of persecution. All right. Third church.
The death.
Pergamos. We'll go through this quickly so we can finish here. The third church is Pergamos, starting in verse 12. The name means, Pergamos, the name means elevated, to be raised up.
Okay.
So think about this. The church was just persecuted, and now the church is elevated. Constantine came in, and he puts out this edict of toleration for Christians. And you guys remember the story? He saw a sign in the heavens that said, "Conquer," in the sign of the cross. And he went out and he put crosses on all his soldiers' shields, and he went out and he won the battle, and he said, "Hey, this Christian God,
Works. Huh?
that works for me.
He works.
Yeah, he works. I won this battle. I'm going to worship this Christian God." And then he literally told his soldiers, march through the river. They marched through the river. They came out and said, "All right, you've all been baptized. You're all Christians now." Right?
Yeah.
So now Constantine gets this idea that I like Christianity. And he starts making it, in a way, the official religion of the empire. Constantine orders 50 Bibles to be written that are Bibles that pagans can be okay with. Make a few changes in them. And let's make Christianity the religion of the state. And so he makes this major push that Christians are, it's not only that Christians are no longer persecuted, now it's cool, it's hip to be a Christian, it's in vogue. And the church is now elevated. But there's compromise that's required. So Pergamos means elevated. This is the period of the corruption of the church's doctrines. The time period is about 513, the end of the persecution, till about 538 AD. Does anyone know what this statue is?
Jupiter was Zeus, so Jupiter. Well, it's the same. It's the same guy.
Exactly.
The Greek.
This was Zeus, Jupiter.
Yeah.
Somebody close the door for me, please. We'll be done in a sec. Thank you. This is a statue taken out of the pantheon or the pagan temple of Zeus, and they just put it into the church and they renamed it Peter. And if you look at a close up of it, you can see it has the horns of Zeus. It's Zeus. Notice the solar disk on top? That's a sun symbol.
Yes.
And then the church has started adopting that as, well, that's a halo. Where did you get the idea of a halo? Where's that in the Bible?
No.
It's not in the Bible. It's a sun disk. It's sun worship. That's what it is. So that's literally, and he's doing the pagan occult symbol here. That's Zeus. And if you notice, you look down there, his foot, his big toe on his foot there.
It looks like that. This other foot has like a sandal on it. It looks
Yeah,
like.
he's got a sandal here.
But the first one doesn't.
The first one doesn't. The toe is worn off
Yeah.
because it's been kissed for centuries. And Christians go in there.
That's right.
It's sad. Christians go in there to this day and they kiss Zeus's
This
foot.
is foot.
They say, it's
They
Peter.
did not know.
It's not
They
Peter.
don't know.
They don't know. They don't know. This is a time of corruption in the church. This is,
This actually is very symbolic, you know that? Because Zeus and Jupiter were like the supreme god.
yes.
And they're saying that Peter
It's the
is the
supreme.
supreme god. So the papacy
Of the
you know,
church.
is
Is the
like,
supreme because it's the seat of
He
Peter.
is the first bishop,
Exactly. The greatest one.
the first pope of
Yeah.
the Catholic Church.
So, this is a picture of, I can't remember the name of it, but this was a pagan temple. Pagan temple. And look this up. Look up the Christianization of, what is it called? No, it's called Christian reinterpretation. And during this time period, Christian scholars argued that they should take over ancient pagan churches or temples, ancient pagan statues, all the symbols of paganism. They should take them all and Christianize them, because that meant that we have conquered the pagans. That's what they argued. And so a lot of the temples, the pagan temples that exist to this day, they exist because Christians took them over and made them churches. So this is a pagan temple, but it's a church today.
They made it Christian.
They literally turned the pagan temples into churches. They literally turned the pagan statues into statues of saints. So that's the time period, right? Very interesting. So corruption in the teachings. Now let's look. Let's look at this. Pergamos, starting in verse, where are we at here? 13?
go,
For 12.
go.
Unto the angel of the church of Pergamos write, these things saith he that has this sharp sword with two edges. What is that? That is the word of God, right? That divides truth from error.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
You'll see the theme here is the word and doctrine, right? I know thy works, and where thou dwellest, even where Satan's seat is. What is Satan's seat?
No,
The throne of Satan.
The throne of Satan. What is Satan's seat? It's whichever empire is in power in those days, basically.
yeah.
It's Rome in those time periods. Now, Colleen mentioned this earlier. When Satan is depicted in the Old Testament, he's compared to pagan kings. In Ezekiel 28,
That's true.
it's the king of Tyre.
Tired.
And you'll read Ezekiel 28 and it says, thus saith the Lord unto Tyrus, unto
Yes.
the king of Tyre. And it starts talking about him, and it's obviously the king of Tyre. It starts rebuking him and describing him. And then it just switches out of nowhere. It doesn't tell you it's switching. It just immediately starts talking about Satan. And
that's
starts
Lucifer.
saying things
Oh,
saying,
Lucifer, how
you are the anointed cherub that covers. And you say that the king of Tyre was never an anointed angel on the, and so it's obviously not the king of Tyre anymore, now it's talking about Satan. But it puts the two together because they're similar. Because Satan is the one who rules through these corrupt governments, right?
So Satan sit there is the Rome.
Exactly. It's the Roman Empire. This is the time period when the church was very popular in the Roman Empire. I know where you dwell, where Satan's seat is. Do you guys see that? And the same thing is in Isaiah 14. It goes from the king of Babylon, and then starting in verse 12, it just says, "O Lucifer, son of the morning." That's not the king of Babylon anymore, that's Satan. And it's because the two are similar. Okay. So I know where your seat is, where you dwell, even where Satan's seat is. Okay? Verse 14. "But I have a few things against thee." Oh wait, did I skip that? Oh yeah, verse 13, it references the previous persecution. Verse 13. "I know where you dwell, where Satan's seat is, and thou holdest fast my name." Isn't that interesting? Keeps the name. The church keeps the name, right? "You have not denied my faith." Okay, so they're still Christians. "Even in the days wherein Antipas was my faithful martyr." So it says in those days, right? So it's a previous persecution. "Who was slain among you where Satan dwells." Where was the church persecuted? It was persecuted in Rome. Where Satan dwells. What does Antipas mean, by the way? It literally means anti-fathers. Pas, like papa, like pope, right? Anyway, we won't go into all that. Verse 14. "But I have a few things against thee, because thou hast there them that hold to the doctrine of Balaam." Notice the doctrines are false now, right? Balaam, what was Balaam's thing?
The post-rapid.
He tried to corrupt the church, right? "Thou hold to the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel." So now there's stumbling blocks in the church. "To eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit fornication." And I have here spiritual fornication. So here's a picture of some priests. Now this is more modern times, because this is the picture I could find, but you can imagine this is what happened in those days. The priests, and they're carrying their idol, which is Mary, right? So now you have idol worship in
We
the
have that
church.
in the Philippines. They
Exactly.
dance.
They do that all over Mexico, right? So here we have idol worship in the church. To cast a stumbling block before the children of Israel,
Yes, I do.
to eat things sacrificed to idols, and to commit spiritual fornication. What is spiritual fornication?
Worshiping idols.
Well, if the church is the bride and God is the groom, it's cheating on God with other
Yeah,
gods.
it's fornicating.
Unfaithful church.
Yes.
Exactly. Okay, notice this. Verse 15. "Thou hast also them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans."
Oh, now it's
Okay.
inside.
Now it's inside the church. Do you see that?
They don't hate it anymore.
They don't hate it anymore. The first church, it said you hate
They
the teachings
hate
of the
the
Nicolaitans.
Nicolaitans.
Now it says you has them that hold the doctrine of the Nicolaitans. So Gnosticism
The
has
Gnosticism.
taken root in the church. We see false teachings, the doctrine of the Nicolaitans, the doctrine of Balaam, right?
And God still hates it.
And God still hates it.
He
He
didn't
hasn't
change his mind,
changed.
Father.
He hasn't changed his mind.
Right.
Verse 16, "Repent, or else I will come upon thee quickly and fight against thee with the sword of my mouth." Again, the word of God is mentioned, right? So we see this contrast between the word of God and these false doctrines. That's the theme of this section. And then the outro, "He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says unto the churches. To him that overcome, I will give to eat of the
Hidden manna.
manna." What is manna a symbol of?
There's a bread.
It's
The
better hate
bread which came from heaven, right? And which is a symbol of Jesus, but it's also a symbol of
the word.
the word. "Man shall not eat by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Okay, last point here. We looked at the first three churches. That's the first three. The 7 seals give the same idea, but actually very briefly. And the perspective is from the perspective of the word, because now we're dealing with the table of showbread. Okay, so we saw apostolic church, persecuted church, and then the church becomes corrupt. First three seals, this is our last slide. First three seals. Go to Revelation chapter 6, and you'll see the same time periods mentioned again, very briefly this time. First three seals. Verse 1, and I saw when the Lamb opened the seals and heard, and it was, as it was the noise of thunder, one of the beasts saying, "Come and see." And I saw and behold a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth conquering and to conquer. This is the apostolic church going out to conquer. It's got a crown of victory on it, right? It's a white horse, which is a symbol of purity. The church is still pure these days, right?
Apostolic.
Notice this, it says it has a bow. What does it not have?
An arrow?
There's no arrows.
No arrow.
How do you go with a bow to conquer without arrows? It's conquering through peace. Do you see that? So see, this is the time of the great expansion, missionary expansion, the pure white horse, the white church. This is the apostolic church. It
That's a
grew
good
in
point.
those days.
That's a good point. No arrow.
No arrows, right? Notice this, next time period. What should we expect next? Persecution, right? Verse 3, and he opened the second seal, and I heard the second beast say, "Come and see." And there went out another horse that was red. And power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword. So now, before we had conquering through peace, now peace is taken away. The horse is red, the symbol of blood, right? And a great sword is given. This is the time period of persecution. Does this make sense? It comes right in order, right? Like it should.
Yes,
What should come next?
black horse.
Well, in history, it should be the time of corruption of the church, right? Right?
So that's why there's a famine.
Slow down. Slow down. Let's read it. Okay, verse 5. And when he had opened the third seal, I heard the third beast say, "Come and see." And behold, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. What's that? Scales. And I heard a voice from the midst of the four beasts says, "A measure of wheat for a penny." Now that's a penny. You're thinking, oh, that's nothing, right? No. The word there means a day's wages. So a measure of wheat, it's a small amount of wheat for a day's wages. It's very expensive to get wheat. And 3 measures of barley. Barley is cheaper bread, cheaper than wheat, but it still costs a day's wages for a penny. And see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. So we see here many symbols. There's a famine. You weigh bread out during a famine, right? In the Old Testament, they would eat measured, measure the water, measure the bread, right? Because it's a famine. So we have this period of famine, but famine for what?
The word.
Bread is a symbol of the word, right? So the wheat and the barley are restricted. There's a famine for the word. False teachings are in the church now. But what is not hurt? The oil and the wine. What is oil a symbol of?
Spirit.
It's the Holy Spirit. What is the wine a symbol of?
It's the blood
The blood of Christ. Salvation, right? So salvation is still available. And the Holy Spirit is still available. But there's a famine for the word. Do you guys see that? It fits exactly this time period of corruption of the teachings of the church.
Right.
Exactly. So that's the first 3 churches and the first 3 seals. Kept you guys a little late again, sorry. But that's okay. Any question?
So this is almost like Daniel, right? It's like a parallel. It's the same church but parallel, and you get more pictures.
It's the same,
What the church looks like in those days.
you mean the seals?
The seals.
Yeah, it's the same idea, kind of
Same
from
parallel.
a different perspective. Yeah, I think more from the perspective of the word.
So this has all happened already?
All history.
Yeah,
It's all history.
Sorry again,
Yes.
because before, you may have mentioned already 7 seals, what is the implication again of 7 seals? So I can just make a parallelism or connection.
Just the idea. Well, seals are on a scroll. So it's this scroll with 7 seals.
Mhm.
And a scroll would be like a book, right?
Mhm.
So the idea is this is the section of Revelation that's compared with the table of showbread. So you have the bread and this book, right? So the perspective is, the theme of this section is the book, the word,
Oh.
right? So you kind of see it from the perspective of, so you have this focus on a famine of the word, and, you know, as opposed to when the church was conquering with the word. And so that's the idea. Does that make sense? Okay. Went over it quickly. Next week we'll go through the last 4 churches and the last 4 seals. Somebody want to say a word of prayer for us?
You can go.
Involved.
Okay. Lord in heaven, we are very